If the government considered the impact of its COVID-19 decisions on children, it never evidenced it, writes Rachel Smalley this week. And Rachel, the masks are off, but you've been observing some interesting reactions in the young people in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always felt that throughout COVID, we've very much been focused on the vulnerable and the physically vulnerable, I guess, and very much our older generations and those with pre-existing health conditions. But I think I'm really interested to know what impact COVID and the response that we had to COVID had on our youth and some of our children. And I say that because when I consider my son, who's now almost 14, we went into lockdown on his 11th birthday. And, he spent about 15% of his life in lockdown or in COVID restrictions. I've spent about 4% of my life in that space. So I think it's been really impactful on children. I think quite often we've talked about children as being resilient, but are they? Do we know that for sure? And I wonder about some of the restrictions that we've placed on kids living behind masks, so much time off school, and particularly for, say, for example, children like my son, who's an only child, just what impact it has had on our children and some of our youth and the way that we've responded to COVID.
And you've been hearing from teachers that, the effect on mental health that they've observed
Yeah.
has been quite bad.
Absolutely. I've got two friends who are teachers, and I have said to them, what impact do you think it's had on children? And they've said horrendous, and in particular on mental health. And they said they really notice a difference in children when they do come back to school, particularly all of the loss of that social structure that they've had for much of their childhood. Some children, they say, have had delayed starts to school. And, anyone who's had children will know that by the time they're 5, they are more than ready to be at school. And some of those children who've been delayed, and they never form those bonds and those friendships like they do when they're consistently at school. So I think, as part of an inquiry into COVID, I would really like, should the government commission one, I would really like to look at what impact it had on children, because I think they've been something of the silent survivors, but the silent sufferers as well of COVID. We've really put everything on hold. And I think about my son, who's missed out on a lot of sport, a lot of interaction. Even recently with when I had COVID, he's forced into a week's isolation, and his dad had COVID, another week's isolation. He misses out on assessments. He misses out on that interaction at lunch. Lunchtimes. For my son, it's all about handball at break and soccer at lunchtime and talking incessantly about Minecraft. Mum's pretty boring to be around for a solid 7 days of isolation, and he continually tested negative the entire time. So I would really like to know what impact it's had on education, on mental health in our youth, and how that's played out as well in terms of some of the areas we're now seeing with youth crime.
Yes, well, of course, it's particularly in lower socioeconomic areas. Principals are saying they've seen so many children that just haven't even returned to school. So
Yeah.
there's got to have been an impact that we haven't seen yet.
Absolutely. And I think when you think about, some of the lower socioeconomic areas of society, it's those people who are actually forced to work and work through COVID, alpha COVID. And so you think about sort of some of the concerns and the fears that some children would have had when their parents were going out, either as courier drivers or working in supermarkets, and what impact did that have on children? Because I think sometimes the government lost sight of the fact that when it was communicating through those updates, there were always children in the background. And so they were messaging, and there was a lot of fear that was used as I think a tool of compliance. And while the government may have been speaking to adults, there were always children around as well. And I certainly know some parents I've spoken to, their kids were terrified about seeing their grandparents, because they were convinced that if they had this virus, they were going to give it to their grandparents, and potentially, the grandparents were going to die. So in hindsight, I really do think it's an area of society that we may have overlooked in the COVID response. What impact did it have on our kids?
And an inquiry would be a good thing in your view.
Yeah, absolutely. I know Judith Collins called for this just before she stood down. There are continued calls for it. It makes sense, right? This won't be our last rodeo. We will have another pandemic. What do we do right? What do we do wrong? But I think any inquiry should look beyond just the economic response. That's really important. but also the social response, also the health response. How many people went undiagnosed with, cancers such as bowel cancer and lung cancer? Who did it impact? How many surgeries were delayed? And what impact did that have on health when we really were using I guess the death toll as a measure of our success or otherwise? It had far-reaching implications, and there's a lot we can learn from the response, but only an inquiry and an independent inquiry will reveal that.
Rachel Smalley, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Maria.